don't think my father in particular was very good at getting on the level of a child, particularly when I was quite young. As a little bit older, as a teenager or a preteen, he could be playful and funny, but for very limited periods of time. So that's quite different that way as a parent. I also have a son who is neurodivergent, has an autoimmune disorder which really messes with him and messes with us. And I know that I am a much more patient parent than, well, my father often tells me, you're much more patient than I ever could have been, and I know that's true. The book concerns 1-hour sessions that my father had with a number of, the phrase he likes is fellow travelers, people who sought help from him. And the thing that kept coming up over and over and over during these sessions for him was that the people he was encountering, more than anything, were desirous of an encounter with another human being that had depth, that had warmth, that had a certain type of intimacy to it.
What did you learn from your father, what it means to be a man?
To turn that on its head a little bit, I think I probably learned more about gender from my mother than I did from my father. My mother was a feminist scholar and early 70s. So the question of gender roles and who deserved what or why was very present in our household. So questioning traditional gender roles was there very early on.
Hi everyone, I have a very special guest here with me today, Benjamin Yalom, a San Diego-based psychotherapist, creative coach, theater maker, and writer. Hi Ben, I am so glad we have the chance to talk.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. I wish I could be there in person, but this will have to do for now.
Your father, Irvin D. Yalom, is one of the most well-known contemporary representatives of existential psychology. His works are widely read and loved here in Hungary as well. And the existential framework, which addresses the big questions of life, is also somewhat prominent in your joint book. Why do you think so many people around the world resonate with this approach today in 2025?
I think a couple of things. One, the mainstream of psychology or psychotherapy, certainly in America, I don't know exactly in Europe or in Hungary specifically, but is very focused on solving problems, making people functional in our economy. So I'm thinking about things like cognitive behavioral therapy or DBT that are sort of quick fixes and address not surface level, but a more surface level type of problem. And that said, we're all human beings and we all have to deal with the specific challenges of being human. And by that I mean human in a deep way. So philosophical issues come up for all of us, even if we don't frame them in our minds as being philosophical. And that's where my father's work and the work of existential therapists come into play, because we can solve a simple problem. My girlfriend broke up with me and I'm upset. My partner is unhappy with certain things about the way I behave, or I don't like my job. Those are important, but they don't address big issues like what does it mean to seek meaning in a world where there is no inherent meaning, or what do I do as a human being when I'm aware of my mortality, when I realize that I'm going to die someday, as we will all. And this brings up deeper questions, and that's the stream or the river in which the existentialist therapeutic world lives, and where my father's questions and work exists. And I think those are questions that are powerful and important and challenging regardless of the era in which we live. But you say, why now specifically? I think in part because there's such a huge movement to distract, to entertain, and then when we seek help from the challenges we have, often they're very simple or manualized solutions that don't provide the serious need and succor that many of us need.
If we were to think in terms of current mainstream psychology, the title of your book might be The Hour of the Brain or The Hour of the Neurotransmitters, right? Why did you? Exactly. Yes. Why did you choose The Hour of the Heart instead as the title?
This is a great question, and actually I hadn't thought of it since we came up with the title. So for those who might be interested in reading the book or who have read it, the book concerns 1-hour sessions that my father had with a number of, the phrase he likes is fellow travelers, people who sought help from him. And the reason he was doing it in this very short format, which is quite antithetical to his work throughout the decades, is that his memory was failing as he reached his late 80s and 90s, and he was unable to provide the sort of long-term engaged therapy that he had for so long. But he thought, let's see what happens if we do this short-term therapy and see how can I be helpful in this period of time. And the thing that kept coming up over and over and over during these sessions for him was that the people he was encountering, more than anything, were desirous of an encounter with another human being that had depth, that had warmth, that had a certain type of intimacy to it. And he has felt that way for a long time, that the majority of people who come to him have concerns that concern human connection. And this sounds like it strays a little bit from the existential work, but ultimately it really doesn't. One of the main solutions to feeling isolated in the world, one of the great existential concerns, is to connect deeply with another human being. Perhaps the best solve for anxiety around death is also connection with another. So it's right in line with existential concerns. But what he found was most powerful for the majority of the people who came to him for these 1-hour sessions was to have a deep, intimate connection. And also that many people lacked that in their life, in part because they didn't know how to open up. And that's a challenge most of us face as therapists, of how do we get our clients to open up to us. And the path that he started exploring during this year of sessions was the idea that if he were to open up, if he were to model a certain degree of intimacy and vulnerability, that often was key to letting the people who came to him see that it was okay, or see how one might do that, and thus open up in return. And that feeling, that emotional intimacy, is very much closer to the heart than to the brain.
What is the significance of this kind of self-disclosure, what you mentioned, and why are still so many professionals reluctant to use it?
That is as we say, the $64,000 question. Not only is the mainstream of the field still very reluctant to use it, it's sort of doubly ironic because I've trained as a therapist quite recently. It's sort of my second career, and over and over, I would meet people who, when they found out that I was my father's son, would say, "Oh my God, I read Love's Executioner or The Gift of Therapy, and that's what made me want to become a therapist." But then they go into their training and they're taught not to disclose, not to give of themselves, not to open themselves up. Whether that's said explicitly, maybe not so much, but it's implicitly the model. All the models avoid talking about the self in a deep, open way that actually reveals you as a human being, with one or two minor exceptions. So, when we ask the question of why is that still the case, that the training goes against the idea of self-disclosure, for one, my father has remained baffled and frustrated by that for decades. And as his work has gone on, it's just been more and more and more self-disclosure. And really part of the goal of this book was to test, can I go too far? Will it start to be detrimental at some point? And within at least the models or the boundaries that he experiments here, he doesn't feel like it ever really goes too far. Now, I suspect there are a few main reasons why we are taught to avoid or be fearful of self-disclosure. I suspect that one main reason is that psychotherapy still, will always have its roots in a medical model that, came from Freud from the beginning, and beyond that, in the struggle to feel validated or appear valid within a world that medicine was largely scientific. So I think that's sort of where the endeavor of, or the endeavor of psychotherapy began, and we've never shaken that off fully. I think there's also within that a sense of expertise as being important. I come to you as an expert, and therefore my words have more weight than a friend who might converse with you and reflect things in your life or give you feedback. And even though some people might not feel like we're trying to be experts, there's still a reluctance to really put ourselves, and by that I mean practitioners, therapists, on an equal plane with our clients, and so not to be the expert, but to be truly a fellow traveler who has just seen a different part of life. I suspect there's ego involved for many, not all, but for many. And here's the last tricky part, is that to really give that status up and to not only be willing to be on the same level, but to open oneself up repeatedly, as we have session after session after session with our clients, requires a certain type of emotional resilience. Because if I have a deep emotional experience with you in our session, it has an impact on me. It should have an impact on me. And so we need to learn and bring into our training, really, how we as therapists become emotionally capable of opening ourselves up over and over, and then dealing with the aftermath of that. From that regard, it's not an easy challenge to do. If you're truly opening yourself up, it is going to have impacts on you, and you're going to have days where you're deeply emotionally exhausted and have another client coming in 10 minutes.
To be vulnerable as a therapist as well.
Yeah, but I guess the final thing that I would say about that, and that my father, I very much think, would say about that, is that's part of the job. We just have to accept I don't know who said it was going to be an easy job.
Yeah, sure. And what are the potential advantages and disadvantages for the therapeutic process if the therapist is a public figure or a well-known or famous person? So how does the name Yalom affect your clients, for instance?
Well, we'll talk very quickly about my father's clients as it comes out in the book, but that does then come down to me.
Okay.
My father talks in the book several times about seeing clients who actually had some fear of him or were in awe of him, and these are largely therapists who have come to see him, who find themselves in that position, but they know him or they know his works, and so there's a challenge, even a double challenge, for him to become open and show that he's a person and not a public figure. And those stories are told in the book. For me, it does come up often because many of the people who seek me out because of the family name. And at first, when I was just beginning, I felt that as like an awful lot of challenge and pressure. Like, oh my God, I have to be this amazing therapist because I have very high expectations. And also with the writing of the book and going to do readings everywhere, and I'm being the one who's doing the readings because my father no longer does that, I've just realized that for some, I will start off as a disappointment immediately. If you come to the reading hoping to see my father, I'm sorry, I'm not him. If you come to therapy seeking my father, I'm sorry. And that's fine. I've gotten used to that. And now I've sort of found, how I can leverage that to my advantage, often with clients more than readings, is to say I'm given a certain extra status when clients come to see me. Not by all of them, but by many. And there are two things that can be helpful in that. The first is that for some, my words will carry extra weight. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But the advantage is if I am somehow being helpful, or if I am saying something that it is important for the client to take seriously, that's already sort of embedded in the way they're going to take my words. And we want to be important to our clients. I don't want to come off, as we said earlier, I don't want to come off as this distant expert, but I do want my word to be important so that it has a greater impact. So that's one advantage. And the other advantage, and this is almost counterintuitive, but if we're talking about vulnerability and openness and the willingness to open up to somebody, and I show real vulnerability and a certain intimacy with them, particularly for clients who come in feeling like they're not important enough, or somehow their position in the world they don't deserve good things to happen to them, which is a surprising number of us. And then I, important, Yalom, capital Y, show that I really care about them and I take their challenges seriously in the world. I think that gives them a greater sense of the importance of their being. So it aids me in that intimacy building process in a way.
You mentioned earlier that being a psychotherapist was your second career choice. Did you consciously stay away from this field for decades? And if that was the case, then what inner processes led you to finally decide to pursue it?
Yeah, well, that is the question of my life in the last number of years. Okay. So I very much, as a young man in my early 20s, said, I am not going to go be a psychotherapist because I do not want to live my life in my father's shadow. That seemed like a bad idea. Fortunately for me, there was another area that was extremely compelling and that I was passionate about, which was theater. And I spent 25 years first learning how to write, because I knew some point in my life I would want to do that endeavor, and then becoming a theater director and theorist. And I started a theater company in San Francisco in 1998 called Fool's Fury. And for the next 23 years, we had this amazing laboratory of theatrical exploration. And I will say that, just to sort of maybe give a little foreshadowing, the work that we did was very much exploring deep, important questions, but through theater making. So, it wasn't completely distant. We weren't sort of picking up old plays and doing things that were pure entertainment. We were actively exploring, I think, important philosophical questions through that medium. And then about 7-8 years ago, I had had a couple of young children, and being a theater director for very little pay in the experimental theater world where I traveled around a lot, just didn't work very well with my family. And I contemplated teaching more. I had been teaching for some time, and started looking in that direction to try and make the lifestyles more compatible. But through all of this, I was really clutching my identity as an artist and as a theater maker. And, if I had been my own client, I would have been like, maybe you don't need to hold on so tightly to this. But I very much had this deep-seated fear and question of, if I am not a theater maker, who am I in the world? And I just really held on very tightly. But at a certain point, I realized it just wasn't logistically working out. And then the universe did me a favor, which was COVID. It was not a favor in many ways, but it did result in all the theaters in the world closing simultaneously. And that, after a while, that allowed me to start to think, well, what else might I do? And at that point, two things were happening for me. One, during the later years of my work with my company, I realized that what was becoming more and more important to me was the deep exploration that my actors and writers and the people I was working with were doing in the work. And our projects went from, we would grab a play that was already written and we would interpret the text, try to do it in a powerful way, and then we would get up and perform it. That's how we started, and that's what most theater companies do. But towards the end, we were creating our own work through deep exploration in the studio. These things would take years to do because we were really exploring things, which was horribly inefficient and extremely expensive, but deeply gratifying. And I realized that what I was most interested in, and what I'd become most interested in, was that deep exploration into people's experiences. And I watched the growth that I was having and that many of the performers and artists I worked with were having in their lives as a result of this work. And there was something deeply beautiful and compelling to me. Sometimes we could provide a little bit of that for our audiences. But that at its best, theater was sort of a ritual that allowed us all to become richer, fuller human beings. So I started to think about, well, what else? What else? What other endeavor in the world helps you with that? And therapy was the obvious choice. So suddenly these things didn't seem so different to me, or certain ways of doing both things didn't seem that different. I think there's very bad drama therapy and there's very bad theater as therapy, but I think there are places where these things intersect very beautifully. And then the other thing that had really changed was I think I had come into my own as a human being and as an adult, and it was my father's, I believe it was his 89th birthday, and it was that little time in COVID where there was a break, where the first vaccines had come out, and I went up to see him for his birthday, and he didn't look so scary anymore, or at least the idea of his presence in the field didn't seem so intimidating. And I looked around the party, and there were all these people I'd known for many, many years who were his colleagues, and they all seemed like very interesting people who were pretty happy with their lives. And I thought, okay, this is maybe it's time to join the family business and become a therapist.
I'm sure I'm not the first one to ask this, but what was it like growing up in your family? I mean, how high were the expectations when it came to performance? Or, I don't know, did you talk more about emotions than most families did at the time? Of course, it is like hard to tell what the average was. I don't know.
It's very hard to tell. It's a little bit the air I grew up breathing, so we don't see that very well. But I have been giving it a lot of thought lately, particularly as my father's really aging, and I have a lot of time to reflect on sort of what my inheritance from my parents, my true inheritance as a human is. So I think a few things. One, I think the type of conversation that we had at the dinner table was probably not the norm. Maybe it was the norm in high level academia, parents in the humanities. But my parents were always talking at the dinner table about lofty concepts and ideas and writers they'd read and things that were compelling to them. And perhaps even in comparison with my siblings, who were quite a bit older, I was essentially an only child for most days. So, I didn't have anybody to talk to about the things that were interesting to a 12 or a 15-year-old for the most part. So I got pretty used to understanding ideas in philosophy and literature, at least on some basic level. My mother in particular was very, very brilliant at taking complex academic ideas and sort of making them accessible. So that was, I think, a blessing for me. The other thing, when you asked about emotional content, in some ways, I think, I think things were more intellectual than emotional. But I remember many times my father sort of trying to help me through emotional moments and bringing in, he must have been bringing ideas in from his therapeutic work because I'm so familiar with so many of them. They seem quite natural to me. I read through, for instance, The Gift of Therapy. I just happen to have a copy of right here. And I'm like, oh yeah, I remember one time when I was at a sporting event and he pulled me aside to try and coach me through a moment when I was frustrated or something like that. And he used this idea. So I think it was quite the norm. You asked also about expectations. And that's a tricky one for me because I think I internalized them all very early on. So I think the expectations were very high. But I never remember my parents telling me I had to get good grades. I just understood that I was supposed to get good grades. They never, I don't think they ever told me, oh, you need to go to this university and get this mark or this level. But I just knew that was a requirement in life. So
Their example, yeah.
And struggled with that mightily throughout my life. I think I've addressed it now. Most of the time feel pretty good with what I'm doing, and but yeah, the expectations were pretty major.
Nowadays, we talk more and more about how traditional gender roles can be also harmful to men, feeling they always have to be strong, tough, willing to take risks. It all can take a toll on their physical and mental health. What did you learn from your father, what it means to be a man?
To turn that on its head a little bit, I think I probably learned more about gender from my mother than I did from my father. My mother was a feminist scholar and early 70s. So the question of gender roles and who deserved what or why was very present in our household. So questioning traditional gender roles was there. very early on. My father, I don't remember my father ever saying anything about this directly. But I will say that my father has always been, I think, a very gentle person. As a young kid, and particularly as a teenager, I certainly was able to make him quite angry sometimes. And I know my siblings were, and probably more so when he was younger. But, by and large, his way of dealing with being in the world is not what one would think of as typically masculine, hard-edged or strong or even emotionally reserved. My father, the gentle person who comes out in his writing and in his interactions with his people who come to visit him, his patients, was very much the real person. And I do think that I and my siblings inherited a lot of that. There was very little pressure to be manly or masculine in that way. As a young adult, it didn't hurt for me, or it certainly was a factor, that I was growing up in San Francisco in the 80s, where gender roles were constantly in question, and there was a very vibrant gay scene, of course, and we had many family friends who were gay and lesbian. So sort of a strong masculine presence was never something that seemed terribly important to me. As I work with my clients, I am increasingly aware of sort of what that man training, as we like to think of it sometimes, of the impact that has on us. And certainly when I look at certain impulses that I have, it's never to, appear manly, but the feeling, some of those expectations for career success, for instance, I think are gendered in a certain way. So some of that is there just in the air that we breathe in our culture, but I certainly didn't learn it directly from my father as a requirement.
As we grow into adulthood, we all face this question of what we would want to carry forward from our parents, what we inevitably carry on, whether we want to or not, and what we and what we want to do differently. In what ways is Benjamin Yalom a different father and a different psychotherapist than Irvin D. Yalom?
Well, I think as a parent, quite different. Sometimes I would like to be a little bit more like my parents, but I have 3 children right now, 7, 9, and 12. They are much more unruly than I was, or that my siblings were. My mother, in particular, was sort of the keeper of order. She had a very brilliant mind, curious mind, but also somewhat rigid and somewhat formal rules for how we were to behave. For instance, this phrase sounds quite cliche, but the idea that children should be seen and not heard, I'm sure that maybe never happened in my family, but I was told that often, probably because I was being heard very loudly. But if were I to say that to my children, they would just look at me like I was from Mars and then start laughing. So my children certainly are much freer from those concerns. I sometimes wish I could bring a little bit more order, but my children are delightful and playful and creative. And most of the time I embrace that. I don't think my father in particular was very good at getting on the level of a child, particularly when I was quite young. As a little bit older, as a teenager or a preteen, he could be playful and funny, but for very limited periods of time. I mean, he still has that playfulness with my kids, but not for any prolonged period of time, a few minutes here or there. So that's quite different that way as a parent. I also have I have a son who is neurodivergent, has an autoimmune disorder which really messes with him and messes with us, and I know that I am a much more patient parent than, well, my father often tells me, you're much more patient than I ever could have been, and I know that's true. I also wasn't that patient at first, but I have learned to be more patient. And my wife is a great influence on me as a parent. As a therapist, this is an interesting question. So I embrace many of the concepts that I've learned from my father and through being an active reader and editor of my father's works over the years. The basic positioning of therapists vis-a-vis fellow traveler and being willing to open up of myself is very much true for me with my work, and I'm thankful that I learned that from him. I do take an existentialist lens on most of my clients. I'm maybe less focused on death anxiety than he is, or the impact of mortality. I just don't experience it, I think, as much in my life as the driving force. And I think he does, or did. He's kind of over it now at this age, but and I think we're always colored by our own drives. I'm much more driven by the idea of meaning and helping my clients uncover what's truly meaningful for them and then try to align their living with what they find meaningful. And then there are two other things that are real differentiators. I don't feel they're contrasts, but they differentiate. The first is that I've gotten a lot of training in narrative therapy. And so my other great teacher in my career right now is Tom Carlson, who's the head of my program. And I'm fascinated with this work, which essentially begins from the positioning that what impacts us most is the stories that we tell ourselves about our life, not necessarily the direct problems that we're having. And I like, if my father used the stuff of therapy to create literature, this almost flips it on its head and says, what are the tools of literature that we can use in our therapy? So I enjoy that. And I've been obsessed with storytelling, all through my theater years, so it fits in nicely that way. The other area, and this is very different from my father's work, not philosophically, but in its implementation, is that I have drawn on all this years of theater work, particularly work that is based in the body, not so much in the writing or the dialogue, but in the how does the body become an expressive tool, which was the research in my theater for decades. I'm bringing a lot of that forward into my therapy work. So I'm developing a whole curriculum for a type of group therapy that has to do with people accessing, exploring, and then expressing themselves gesturally with their bodies, much more than with the discursive language that we tend to use when we're in talk therapy. And I've had the chance now to be practicing this quite a bit. It's very powerful. And I think for many of us, discursive language, rational language is amazingly helpful, and we're good at it. But for a lot of us, it's not the best medium of exploring our emotions or our experiences. So I'm working on a different modality that I'm calling Yalom creative body and mind therapy. And it's really about using the creative tools from creating devised theater and adapting them for therapeutic ends.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting and useful. Yeah, you co-authored The Hour of the Heart with your father. What was your process like? How can such a collaboration strengthen intimacy rather than create tension between family members?
That's a very good question, because we did a lot of work collaboratively over the years, and sometimes that was helpful, but often that was very much him sending me things and then calling me up right away saying, did you finish it? Did you edit it? Do you have comments? Because he's a very anxious individual, so demanding in that way. And that was not, it was good for learning for me, but it wasn't actually good for us collaboratively, and it did cause some challenges, which we managed by saying, hey, let's not do this for a while. But this process was very different. A couple of things happened. So one, he did these some 300 sessions and wrote up about 40 teaching stories that came from these sessions. And again, those 1 hour sessions came into existence because his memory was starting to fail him. And he wrote quite a bit in the stories about what it was like to have his memory flaking away, is the phrase he liked to use, and how it got him in trouble sometimes, and how sometimes it was eye-opening and useful. But the process was that by the end of writing some 40 stories, he couldn't remember them very well, and he certainly couldn't keep them all in his mind at the same time in order to create a book, to create a useful book that had threads of ideas throughout it. They were really just discrete stories. And also, many of them were quite repetitive because similar format, 1 hour, how much can you do in the hour? So they were, many of them were repetitive, and he also couldn't remember, did story number 37 repeat something in story number 3? So it became clear that he needed help. And we looked around for various people. I was very busy in my life with children and school and all of this. But we ultimately decided that there wasn't anybody else who could do this work. I'm quite a good writer, and we've been working together for decades. And I knew him well enough personally to feel that it would be okay if I took on his voice to try and speak of challenging things. I knew much of the therapeutic theory well enough from having read and worked on his books in the past. But, and this was the big but, I had now finally actually become a therapist, and I knew what it was like to sit on the other side of the chair. So all of the theoretical knowledge that I had took on a hugely different context, meaning, process. So that was the positioning when we sort of sat down and decided that I was going to do this and nobody else could do it, and I had to do it, and I was looking forward to doing it, although somewhat trepidatious, just in terms of how would we collaborate. And what we did was we would take one story, go over it together, I would take it away, I would make some edits, I would bring it back, we would go over it again, and he would say, yeah, okay, this is good. That's how we started. And that wasn't easy, but it seemed to be fruitful going along. And then 2 things happened. Well, I guess 3 things happened. One, I started doing this together, and he kept saying, yeah, that's pretty good, actually. Yeah, okay. And as a result, he started to give me a little bit more creative license. This coincided with him being a little bit less interested in the edits, and because I think at this age, he was like, I don't have this much time left, and wanting to move on to other thoughts instead of go back and do all the revisions. And that continued, that sort of pushed further into, why don't you go work on it for a bit and then bring it back? And this kept going pretty well, so I kept taking on more and more of the revisions to the work. And then, this is sort of unfortunate, but such is life, his memory continued to flake away, decrease, such that it was hard for us even to talk about a particular story in great detail. So I began to make lists of questions particularly when I would write a change in a therapeutic interaction or a response to one in his mind, what he was thinking about when he said something. And then we would meet once a week on Zoom, usually, and I would say, listen, if you were in this kind of situation with a client, and these were what's going on, is this something you would have said? Or does this make sense? And that's the way we would work at that point. So he could still, given a context, could think about, is it a good answer, not a good answer, here's why. And then I would take all that information away and put it back into the work. And I guess part of the reason that was so important was when I began the revisions on the book, I thought, I'm going to make these stories flow well together and his thinking flow well together, but I'm not going to go in and explain most of the theory behind these stories, behind these interactions, because people have read his work before and I don't want to repeat all of that. But the feedback I got from the editor when I handed in that edition, or that draft, was, no, you have to imagine that these people who are reading this book are all new to your dad's work, or some portion of, for some portion of them, this will be their introduction. So you really need to explain all of this. So then I went back through and did another draft where I threaded through the main therapeutic ideas and theories for existential psychotherapy, for the here and now interaction, for the reason behind all the self-disclosure. And that, fortunately, by then I knew pretty well and I was able to do that. But that was work that I would talk to him about it. Does this make sense? Would you say this? He'd agree, usually, or every once in a while disagree. But that was a whole secondary task, which I think makes the book much richer. It can stand alone at this point. But yeah, there was so in parallel with the revisions of the book, there was the further decreasing of my father's memory and our relationship becoming, as it does for many people whose parents are fading, my taking on more and more responsibility and his giving up more and more of the control.
Actually, it was quite amazing reading in the book how your father, even in his 90s, continues to go to therapy, to work on himself, to care for his mental health. How is he doing these days?
Well, I can answer from a couple of different places. One, not very well. He's 94. His health is failing in the terms of he's quite frail. He doesn't walk a whole lot anymore. He's very tired and quite frustrated with being so tired. And his memory has gotten much worse. This is all quite sad. On the other hand, he has really, maybe with the further decrease of his memory, he's given up a lot of feelings that he needs to do one thing or another. And so moment by moment, when I call him and talk to him, he's usually in pretty good spirits. And when I talk to him, his sense of humor is still there. Truly his intellectual light has quite faded now, but his spirits are not bad. His spirits are pretty good.
Okay.
Please send him our very best wishes, and that we have learned so much from him, for which we are really, really grateful.
I certainly will.
One last question, Ben. Do you happen to know why the cat in The Curse of the Hungarian Cat, a short story of your father's, is Hungarian?
My father had maybe 2 or 3 best friends. He had a group of 4 or 5 friends who he was very, very close to throughout his life. And one of them, Bob Berger, was Hungarian, had escaped Budapest in the war. And they wrote a book together called I'm Calling the Police. So he had a certain, probably, affection in his heart, despite, I don't think, having spent much time there. I think he visited with Bob at one point. But that may be a reason.